Welcome. Find a comfortable position. Perhaps you have already been lying down for some time, adjusting the pillow and rearranging the blanket and deciding which way to face, and now you have settled on the arrangement that seems most suitable, and your eyes are perhaps already feeling a little heavier than they were a few minutes ago. That is good. That is exactly right. There is nothing you need to do right now. There is nowhere you need to be. There is only this quiet story about laws that were written down a very long time ago, in places that were cold and mostly dark in the evenings, by people who were trying their best to make the world make sense, and who sometimes produced rules that made complete sense at the time and make very little sense now, and sometimes produced rules that may not have made complete sense even then. This is a story about medieval law, not about battles or plagues or famous monarchs, because those are the kinds of things that can make a person feel alert and interested. And alert and interested is not what we are here for tonight. We are here for the other side of medieval history, the administrative side, the written down in a careful hand side, the rules about what you were allowed to do with your geese on a Tuesday, and whether a baker who sold underweight bread could be dragged through the streets on a sledge, and what exactly constituted a legal definition of a pig within the boundaries of a walled town. We are here for the very specific, very detailed, very thoroughly recorded business of medieval people, trying to regulate their world through an accumulation of rules, many of which overlap with each other, some of which contradict each other, and almost all of which, read at a careful and unhurried pace in the quiet of the evening, are exactly the kind of material that helps a mind stop turning over its own concerns and settle, gently and without drama, into the particular stillness that precedes sleep. So let us begin. There is no hurry. The laws have been waiting for several hundred years. They will wait a little longer while we settle in. Chapter 1. The nature of medieval law. Before we look at any particular laws, it is worth spending a moment on the general nature of medieval law, because medieval law was a rather different thing from what we think of as law today, and understanding this difference will make everything that follows slightly more comprehensible, if not necessarily more sensible. Medieval law was not a single unified system, it was an accumulation. Over the centuries of the medieval period, laws accumulated from many different sources, and these sources did not always agree with each other, and nobody had the job of going through them all and making sure they were consistent. There was Roman law, which had been written down in enormous detail by the Romans, and which survived in various forms and continued to be studied and applied throughout the medieval period. Particularly in southern Europe, there was canon law, which was the law of the church, applicable to an enormous range of matters that we might consider entirely secular today, including marriage and inheritance and the conduct of daily life. There was customary law, which was the law of a particular place as it had always been practiced by the people there, passed down orally through generations before being written down, if it was ever written down at all. And there was statute law, which was law made by kings and lords and parliaments and councils, written down in formal documents and declared to be enforced from a particular date. All of these systems coexisted in the medieval world, sometimes harmoniously and sometimes not. A question that arose in one place might be answered by Roman law, The same question arising in another place might be answered differently by local custom. The church might have its own view on the matter, which could agree with or contradict either of the others, and the local lord might have issued a statute that said something else entirely. The person whose question had prompted all this legal activity would simply have to navigate the best they could. The writing down of laws was itself a significant development. In the earlier part of the medieval period, many rules were simply known, passed from one generation to the next by word of mouth, remembered by the oldest and most respected members of a community, applied in individual cases by people who had knowledge of how similar cases had been handled before. The shift toward written law, which happened gradually and at different rates in different places, changed the nature of law in important ways. Written law could be read by anyone who could read, which was not everyone but was a meaningful group of people. It could be copied and sent to other places. It could be appealed to as a fixed authority, and it could accumulate, each new law joining the existing body of written laws on the shelf, adding to the total weight of regulation without necessarily removing anything that was already there. This last point is important for our purposes, because it explains how you end up with very old laws sitting alongside relatively new ones, sometimes addressing the same situation in different ways, sometimes addressing situations that had long since ceased to be relevant, but that nobody had formally abolished. Laws in the medieval period, as in many other periods, tended to accumulate rather than to be replaced, which means that the body of law at any given time was like a very large and somewhat disorganized library, full of material from many different eras, not all of it equally applicable, not all of it internally consistent, but all of it technically still in force until someone said otherwise. With all of that as background, let us proceed to the laws themselves. Chapter 2. Laws about bread was the most important food in medieval Europe. Almost everyone ate bread, every day, and bread was so central to the medieval diet that its price, weight, and quality were considered matters of public concern significant enough to be regulated by law. Many towns and kingdoms produced what were called assizes of bread, which were detailed regulations specifying exactly how bread was to be made and sold. These regulations, when you read them carefully and slowly, are very thorough and very specific and very calming. The Assize of Bread and Ale in England, which dates to around the 13th century and was updated and reissued periodically over several hundred years, specified the relationship between the price of wheat and the price and weight of bread. The idea was straightforward. When wheat was expensive, bread would be smaller or cost more, and when wheat was cheap, bread would be larger or cost less. The Assize set out these relationships in tables of considerable specificity, covering many different price points and several different types of bread. There was the farthing white loaf and the farthing wheaten loaf and the farthing loaf of common wheat, each with its own set of required weights at each price of grain. Reading through these tables is a very good activity for the late evening. The penalties for bakers who violated the assize were also specified. A baker whose bread was found to be underweight could be punished by being placed on a hurdle, which was a kind of flat sled or frame, with the offending underweight loaf tied around their neck and drawn through the streets of the town so that the community could observe their transgression. This was the punishment for a first or second offence. For a third offence, the baker could be placed in the pillory. The purpose of these public punishments was not merely to shame the individual baker, but to reassure the rest of the population that the bread they were buying was the correct weight, which mattered enormously when bread was the primary food of most people. The enforcement of the assize required someone to do the enforcing. Most towns had officials called elconners or bread tasters, whose job was exactly what it sounds like. They would go to bakers and buy bread and weigh it. They would go to brewers and buy ale and check it. They would compare what they found to what the assize required. If the bread was underweight, they would report it and the punishment process would begin. This was a formal paid position in many towns, and the ale-conner was in particular a figure of some local authority, because ale was also regulated by the assize, and ale was consumed by essentially everyone who could afford it. The ale regulations specified that ale was to be of the correct quality, and sold in measures that had been officially checked and stamped. The official checking and stamping of measures was carried out by the town authorities, who would inspect the pots and jugs used by ale sellers and mark the ones that were the correct size. A pot that had not been officially checked was not supposed to be used for selling ale. The reason for this regulation was obvious, because a seller who used pots that were slightly smaller than they appeared to be could sell less ale while appearing to sell the correct amount, and this was fraud, and fraud was against the law, and against the law was against many other things besides, because in the medieval understanding the proper order of commerce was connected to the proper order of everything else. There were also laws about the location of bakeries. Because bakeries required large fires and large ovens, they were considered a fire risk, and many towns had regulations about where bakeries could be located within the town. They were often required to be near the town walls or in specific quarters, away from the more densely built central areas. The heat of a bakery oven, operating throughout the night if the baker was preparing bread for the next day's market, was a constant feature of the neighbourhood in which the bakery sat, and the neighbours of a bakery experienced this heat and the smell of baking bread as simply part of the background of their lives, so familiar that it ceased to be noticed. Chapter 3. Laws about animals. In towns. Medieval towns were full of animals. This is perhaps obvious when you think about it, but it is easy to forget when we imagine medieval towns as simply smaller and older versions of modern towns. In a medieval town you would expect to find horses tied at posts in the market square, pigs rooting in the gutters of side streets, chickens in the yards of most houses, geese walking in loose groups between buildings, dogs everywhere, and the occasional cow being led through the streets from one place to another. This was not unusual. This was simply what towns looked like. But the presence of so many animals in a relatively confined space created problems, and the problems created laws, and the laws taken together constitute a remarkably detailed attempt to manage the relationship between medieval town dwellers and the animals among whom they lived. Pigs were a particular concern. Pigs were valuable animals that produced meat and lard and leather, and could be fed on scraps and waste, making them economically ideal for households that had very little. But pigs left unsupervised in a town had a tendency to cause problems, They would root through rubbish heaps and spread the contents around. They would trample gardens. They would push over market stalls. They would frighten horses. They would occasionally knock down small children. And so towns produced laws about pigs. London, for example, had repeated regulations about pigs in the streets. In 1281, an ordinance was issued stating that if a pig was found wandering in the streets of London without a keeper, it could be killed by whoever found it, and the finder could keep it. This was a practical regulation because the alternative would have been to create some kind of pig-catching system, and no one wanted to catch medieval pigs. But the law had to be updated and reissued periodically because people kept letting their pigs wander, which suggests that either the law was not very effective, or the reward of a free pig was not sufficient incentive for anyone to actually catch the pigs being encountered, or possibly both. There was also an exception, which is the kind of thing that makes medieval laws particularly interesting. The pigs belonging to the Hospital of St. Anthony, which was a religious institution in London, were allowed to wander in the streets wearing bells around their necks. The bells allowed people to identify the pigs as belonging to the hospital, and therefore not available for the taking. The hospital's pigs were permitted to eat the scraps they found in the streets, which helped feed the pigs at no cost to the hospital. The bells became so associated with the hospital's pigs that the term Tantony pig from St. Anthony came to mean any small or favourite pig. This is a piece of information that is entirely harmless and only mildly interesting, which makes it ideal for the purposes of this story. Geese were regulated in many towns because geese, left to their own devices, would eat the grain that had fallen in the market and the grain stored in sheds, and the grain being transported in open carts. Laws specifying that geese were to be kept in enclosed spaces, or that they were to be kept on leads when in certain parts of the town, were not uncommon. The law about leads for geese has a quality that is difficult to imagine in practice, since geese on leads would create their own kind of disruption. But the law was written, which means someone wrote it, and someone else presumably attempted to enforce it. Dogs were the subject of an enormous number of medieval laws, which is unsurprising since dogs were everywhere and dogs caused all the kinds of problems that animals cause when there are a lot of them and they are not strictly supervised. Dogs chased livestock. Dogs bit people. Dogs disturbed the peace at night by barking. Dogs carried disease. Laws about dogs covered whether dogs could be kept within town walls, what size dogs were permitted in certain areas, whether dogs belonging to forest dwellers had to have their claws removed or their toes maimed so that they could not be used for poaching deer, and what happened to dogs that had bitten someone. The forest laws in England in particular specified that dogs kept within the bounds of royal forests had to be expedited, which meant having 3 toes removed from one front paw to prevent them from being used for hunting the king's deer. The expediting of dogs was carried out periodically at gatherings called dog-leets, which were official occasions with specific procedures. The dog-leet is a concept that is both entirely specific and utterly remote from anything in modern experience, which makes it a pleasant thing to have encountered before going to sleep. Chapter 4. Laws about what you could wear. Sumptuary laws were laws that regulated what people could wear, based on their social rank. These laws existed in many parts of medieval Europe, and are, when read carefully, among the most detailed and most peculiar expressions of the medieval social order that survive. The underlying idea of sumptuary laws was that clothing was a form of social communication, and that if people wore clothing appropriate to a social rank above their actual rank, this would create confusion and disorder. The laws were an attempt to make the visual language of dress say clearly and accurately what someone's social position was. England produced several sets of sumptuary laws, the most detailed of which was the Sumptuary Law of 1363, issued under Edward III. This law divided the population into categories and specified what each category was and was not permitted to wear. It is a long document, and reading through it is a reliably soporific experience, because it is written in the earnest and careful style of medieval legal drafting, and it concerns itself with matters of great specificity, such as the precise width of fabric permitted in the sleeves of a gown, and the circumstances under which a certain type of fur could be used to line the hem of a cloak. The categories in the 1363 law were based on both birth and wealth. The highest nobility could wear what they liked. The lesser nobility had restrictions, but relatively few. Merchants and citizens of a certain level of wealth had their own set of permitted and prohibited items. Yeomen and ordinary people had the most restrictions, and there were specific provisions for agricultural workers that were particularly restrictive, specifying that they were to wear only the coarsest cloth at prices no greater than a certain number of pence per yard, and that they were to wear no fur except sheepskin, and that they were to wear no linen on their heads except of a particular quality. The furs specified in sumptuary laws were a significant area of regulation. Certain furs were reserved for the highest ranks. Ermine, which is the winter coat of the stoat, and which is white with the characteristic black-tip tail, was associated with royalty and the highest nobility. Squirrel fur, particularly the grey-backed squirrel called vair, was used in heraldry to represent the patterning of fur and was also a regulated item. Marten and sable and other expensive furs had their own categories and their own associations with rank, and wearing the wrong fur for your rank was a legal offence, though one that was probably difficult to enforce with any consistency. The problem with sumptuary laws, which was noted by contemporaries and which led to their being periodically reissued in updated forms, was that they were very hard to enforce. Enforcing a law about what someone was wearing required someone to see them wearing it, and to be prepared to report it to the relevant authority, and to have the relevant authority do something about it. In practice, people of sufficient wealth and sufficient confidence simply wore what they wanted and trusted that no one would challenge them. People of less wealth and less confidence probably followed the rules more consistently, not because they were more law-abiding, but because they were less able to absorb the consequences of being caught. The sumptuary laws were probably most effective as statements of the ideal social order, rather than as practical regulations of actual behaviour. France also had extensive sumptuary legislation, and the French laws showed a particular interest in the colour of clothing. Certain colours were restricted to certain ranks. Scarlet, which was both a colour and a type of very fine woolen cloth, was expensive and was associated with high status. The colour purple, made from expensive dyes, was similarly restricted. The colour and quality of the dye used in clothing was part of the visual grammar of social rank, and the laws attempted to maintain the clarity of this grammar by preventing people from reading themselves as more important than they were. In some towns, sumptuary laws also regulated the conduct of feasts and celebrations. The number of courses that could be served at a wedding feast, for example, was sometimes specified. A couple of a certain rank might have 3 courses. A couple of a higher rank might have more. The food itself might be regulated, with certain dishes reserved for the tables of the wealthy, and others considered appropriate for the lower orders. This regulation of food at celebrations was connected to the same underlying anxiety about social display and social positioning that drove the clothing regulations, and it was similarly difficult to enforce and similarly ineffective as a result. Chapter 5. Laws about markets and trade. The medieval market was a regulated institution. The right to hold a market was a privilege granted by the king or the lord, and it came with a set of rules about when the market could be held, who could trade in it, what could be sold, how goods were to be measured and weighed, and what fees the traders had to pay for the right to set up their stalls. These rules accumulated over time into a quite substantial body of market law that governed the commercial life of medieval towns in considerable detail. The granting of a market charter was a significant legal event. A town that received a charter had the right to hold a market on specified days, and this right was valuable because it meant that traders from the surrounding area would come to that town rather than to another, and the fees they paid would go into the town's income rather than someone else's. The competition between towns for market rights was therefore real, and a town that had a market on a Tuesday might strongly object to a neighbouring town being granted a market on the same day, because the traders could only be in one place at once, and the town that had them would have their fees. Laws about the location of trading within the market were common. Different goods were supposed to be sold in different parts of the market. The fish sellers were in one area, the bread sellers in another, the cloth sellers in another, the live animals in the livestock market, which was usually at one edge of the market area because of the noise and the mess the animals produced. These spatial regulations served a practical purpose, because a buyer looking for fish knew where to go, and a buyer looking for cloth did not have to wander through the fish to find it, which was better for everyone. But the regulations also had a quality of civic organisation that went beyond mere practicality, a sense that the market was an ordered place where things had their proper location, and the proper location was maintained by rule. The regulation of weights and measures was, as we have touched on already, a significant area of market law. The standard weights and measures were kept by the town authorities, and traders were required to have their own weights and measures checked against these standards. An official checker called the gauger or the measurer would go through the market and inspect the equipment of the sellers, comparing their weights to the official weights and their measuring rods to the official rod. A seller found using incorrect measures could be fined. The official measures were themselves checked against higher level standards, which were in turn checked against the royal standards, which were the ultimate authority. The whole system was a chain of checking, each link verifying the one below it, all the way down to the person selling grain by the bushel in a country market. There was also a law called the law of forestalling, which made it illegal to buy goods before they reached the market. The idea behind this law was that the market should be a public place where buyers and sellers met on equal terms, and that someone who intercepted goods before they reached the market could buy them cheaply, and then sell them in the market at a higher price, effectively manipulating the market to their advantage. Forestalling was therefore illegal, and so was regrating, which was the practice of buying goods in the market and then reselling them in the same market at a higher price. These laws were widely known and widely evaded, because the logic of commerce tends to produce exactly the behaviours that these laws were trying to prevent, and the people who engaged in these behaviours were often the people with enough commercial knowledge to understand how to avoid being caught. The assay of goods was another regulated activity. An assay was a test of quality, and many goods that were sold in medieval markets were subject to formal quality testing. Cloth was assayed to check its width and its weight per unit area, which were specifications that buyers relied on and that dishonest weavers might try to falsify. Metals were assayed to check their purity. Wine was assayed to check that it had not been adulterated. The officials who performed these assays had specific methods and specific authority, and their seal on a piece of cloth or a barrel of wine or a piece of silver was a guarantee of quality that the buyer could rely on. Selling goods as if they had been assayed when they had not, or selling goods that had failed the assay as if they had passed it, was a serious offence with serious penalties. Chapter 6. Laws about Noise. Medieval towns were noisy places, and the noise of medieval towns was a different kind of noise from the noise we are familiar with. There were no engines, there were no amplified sounds. The loudest sounds in a medieval town were bells, which were struck from church towers to mark the hours and to summon people to services and to announce emergencies, and the human voice in its various modes of declaration and argument and commerce. And there were the sounds of animals, which we have already discussed, and the sounds of work, hammering and sawing and grinding, and the clatter of the market. It was loud, but it was a particular kind of loud, and it had its rhythms. And yet, despite the general acceptance of quite a lot of noise as simply the condition of urban life, medieval towns produced laws about noise. Specifically, they produced laws about noise at particular times and in particular places, which suggest that medieval people had a sense of the distinction between acceptable noise and unacceptable noise, and that this distinction was worth codifying. Laws about noise at night were among the most common. After a certain hour, typically after the ringing of the curfew bell, noise in the streets was supposed to diminish. The curfew, whose name comes from the French, couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire, was originally a signal to cover or extinguish fires for the night. A fire safety measure in towns where buildings were packed closely together and fire was an ever-present risk. But the curfew bell also marked the transition from the active day to the quiet night, and laws reinforced this transition by making nighttime noise an offence. In London, regulations about nighttime disturbances were issued repeatedly, which suggests that they were repeatedly not followed. Regulations against drawing a sword in the streets at night, against shouting and making a disturbance, against playing musical instruments loudly in the hours of darkness, were all part of the legal attempt to maintain the peace after curfew. Whether these regulations were effective is difficult to say. The fact that they were reissued suggests they were not perfectly effective, but the existence of the laws tells us that the people who made them had a clear idea of what nighttime in a town should sound like, which was quiet. There were also laws about specific types of noise in specific places. The noise of smiths was regulated in many towns because smithing was extremely loud, the ringing of hammer on anvil carrying a considerable distance, and because smiths working at night, when the fire of a forge would be very visible and very hot, were a concern both for noise and for fire. Laws restricting smithing after curfew were therefore both noise regulations and fire regulations at the same time, which was efficient. The noise of mills was also sometimes regulated. A watermill running at night made a continuous sound, the grinding of the millstones and the turning of the wheel, that was not extremely loud but was constant, and constant noise, as anyone who has lived near something that makes a steady and unvarying sound will know, can be as disruptive to sleep as sudden noise. Whether medieval people made this specific complaint about mill noise is not clearly recorded, but laws about mill operation at night exist, and they suggest that someone considered the mill's nocturnal activity worth regulating. The ringing of church bells, which was perhaps the most pervasive sound in any medieval town, was regulated by the church authorities rather than by civic law, and the schedule of bell ringing was precise and fixed. The bells rang at matins, which was in the middle of the night or very early in the morning depending on the season. They rang at lauds, which followed matins. They rang at prime, which was dawn. They rang at terce, sext, and none through the day. They rang at vespers in the evening. They rang at compline at the end of the day. They rang to begin services and to end them. They rang for funerals and for celebrations. The bells of a medieval town were so constant and so integrated into the rhythm of life that they were, in a real sense, the sound of time itself, and the regulation of the bells was the regulation of the shared time of the community. Chapter 7. Laws about water and watercourses. Water was essential and water was contested, and medieval law spent considerable time trying to manage both of these facts. The laws about water in medieval Europe cover the rights to use rivers and streams, the obligations to maintain waterways and drainage channels, the rules about throwing things into water, and a variety of other water-related concerns that might not immediately seem like legal matters, but become legal matters when enough people disagree about them. The right to fish in a river was a significant legal question. Rivers were not public property in the medieval sense. They belonged to someone, usually to the lord whose land the river ran through, or in the case of major rivers to the king. The right to fish in those rivers could be granted or sold or inherited, and it was a right with real economic value because fish were an important food, particularly on the many days of the year when meat was religiously prohibited and fish was the alternative. Laws specifying who could fish where, with what equipment, at what times of year, and for what species, were therefore economically important laws that affected the daily sustenance of real people. In England, the Magna Carta of 1215 contained a provision about fish weirs, which were structures built across rivers to trap fish. The provision stated that all fish weirs on the Thames and the Medway and throughout England were to be removed, except on the coast. The reason for this provision was that fish weirs, when built across a river, blocked the movement of fish upstream and also impeded navigation, which affected everyone who used the river for transport. The great lords who owned the rights to build these weirs had built rather a lot of them, and the Magna Carta, which was in most of its provisions a document of the barons asserting their rights against the king, included this provision as something that the barons and others agreed was a problem. Whether all the fish weirs were actually removed is a separate question. The obligation to maintain drainage channels and ditches was an important area of medieval rural law. Fields needed to drain properly for crops to grow well, and drainage depended on a network of ditches and channels that crossed multiple landholdings. A ditch that ran from one person's field through another person's land to the nearest stream needed to be maintained by someone, and if one person in the chain did not maintain their section, the whole drainage system for the fields above it would fail. Laws specifying who was responsible for maintaining which sections of the drainage network and what happened if they did not maintain them were therefore practical necessities. The manor courts that handled local disputes in rural England dealt with a great many cases involving blocked ditches and inadequate drainage. A man whose field was flooding because his neighbour had failed to clear the ditch that ran along the boundary between their properties had a legal remedy, and many of these cases were brought and decided in the regular sessions of the manor court. The records of manor courts, which survive in considerable numbers from the medieval period, are full of exactly this kind of case. Ordinary people bringing ordinary disputes about very local and very specific matters to a local institution that was set up precisely to handle them, and the handling of them, case by case, in a careful and methodical way, is exactly the kind of thing that is entirely without drama and entirely appropriate for reading slowly in the late evening. Laws about throwing things into water were also common. The rivers and streams near towns were used for many purposes, as sources of drinking water, as places to wash, as drainage for household waste, as power for mills, as routes for transporting goods. The combination of drinking water and household waste in the same body of water was obviously problematic, and laws against dumping certain things in rivers near towns were attempts to manage this problem. Butchers were often prohibited from throwing offal into rivers near their shops. Tanners were prohibited from disposing of their chemical waste in town waterways. Dyers were prohibited from dumping their dye residues into streams. These prohibitions were not always followed, as the need to keep reissuing them suggests, but they were genuine attempts to maintain the quality of the water supply. Chapter 8. Laws about the night. We have mentioned curfew already, but the regulation of nighttime activity in medieval towns deserves its own chapter, because the night in the medieval period was a significantly different category from the night as we experience it, and the laws about nighttime activity reflect this difference. After dark in a medieval town, there was very little light. There were no street lights of the kind we are familiar with. The light available was the light of the moon, and the stars on clear nights, the light of fires seen through windows and doors, and the light of any torches or lanterns that individuals might carry. In many towns, carrying a light at night was required by law, not as a convenience, but as a matter of public safety and public identification. A person walking at night without a light was a person who was deliberately concealing themselves, and concealing yourself at night in a medieval town was associated with activities that were not legal or not respectable. The law requiring lights was therefore also a law requiring a certain kind of visibility and accountability. The night watch, about which we spoke in the previous story of the royal palace servants, operated in towns as well as in palaces. The watch was a civic institution in most medieval towns of any size, a rotating duty typically shared among the male householders of a ward or a quarter, each taking their turn to walk the streets at night and to deal with any disturbances or suspicious activities they encountered. The duties and the powers of the watch were specified in law, and the failure to perform watch duty when required was an offence that could be punished by fine. The powers of the watch included the authority to stop and question people found in the streets after curfew. A person found abroad after curfew who could give a satisfactory account of themselves and their purpose would typically be allowed to continue. A person who could not or who refused to answer could be detained until morning and brought before the appropriate authority to explain themselves. This was a significant power, and the exercise of it required the watch members to make judgments about who was and was not suspicious, which in practice meant that strangers and people of low status bore a disproportionate share of the scrutiny. Laws about unlawful assembly at night were common. A group of people gathering in the streets after curfew was presumed to have no innocent purpose, and laws that made such assemblies illegal were attempts to prevent the night time from being used for conspiracy or for collective violence. The logic was that lawful business did not require the cover of darkness, and that the darkness was being sought because what was planned was not lawful. Whether this logic was sound in every case is another matter, but it was the logic behind the law, and it shaped the experience of nighttime in medieval towns in ways that we might find difficult to fully appreciate from our current position. The night in medieval experience was also the time of spiritual danger, the time when demons and spirits and malign influences were believed to be more active than during the day. This was not simply superstition in the dismissive modern sense, but a genuine framework of understanding within which the laws about nighttime behaviour made additional sense. The person who was out after curfew, without a light, was not only failing to identify themselves to their neighbours, they were also, in the medieval understanding, exposing themselves to dangers beyond the merely physical. Laws about nighttime activity were therefore connected to a whole set of beliefs about the nature of darkness, and what it contained that no longer formed the background of our own legal thinking, but that were very real to the people who made and enforced those laws. Chapter 9. Laws about Debt and Credit. Medieval law on debt and credit is a large and complex subject, and we are going to approach only a small part of it tonight, and we are going to approach it slowly and without urgency, because the details of debt law in the 13th century are exactly the kind of thing that is interesting enough to follow, but not interesting enough to wake you up. The fundamental problem with debt in any society is what happens when someone borrows something and cannot or will not give it back. Medieval law addressed this problem in various ways, some of which are recognizable to us and some of which are not. The recognizable solutions included the seizure of the debtor's goods to repay the creditor and the confinement of the debtor until the debt was paid, both of which are variations on solutions that existed in one form or another throughout much of human history. The less recognizable solutions include various kinds of ritual and ceremony that were required to make a debt legally valid in the first place. The requirement for witnesses was fundamental to medieval debt law. A debt that had no witnesses might be legally unenforceable, because without witnesses there was no way to prove that the debt existed except the word of the creditor against the word of the debtor, and words without witnesses were not reliable legal evidence. A creditor who wanted to be sure of being able to recover a debt would therefore ensure that the transaction was witnessed by a sufficient number of people of sufficient respectability. The witnesses themselves were not merely observers. They were in a sense guarantors of the social reality of the transaction, their presence making it officially a thing that had happened in the world rather than a thing that one party claimed had happened. Written records of debts, when they existed, were called bonds or obligations, or, in the form we have already mentioned, tallies. The tally stick deserves a brief digression, because it is a particularly satisfying piece of medieval financial technology. A tally stick was a stick of wood, typically hazel, on which notches were cut to record the amount of a debt or a payment. The notches were cut in different sizes to represent different values. After the notches were cut, the stick was split lengthwise, and each party to the transaction kept one half. The split was irregular, meaning that the two halves would fit back together perfectly and only together, making it impossible to alter one half without it being immediately apparent that the original match had been tampered with. The tally stick was therefore a fraud-resistant record of a transaction, an elegant solution to the problem of maintaining accurate financial records in a world where not everyone could read or write. The Statute of Merchants, which was an English law from 1285, created a system for registering commercial debts. A merchant who was owed money could register the debt with a designated official, and if the debt was not paid, the official could authorize the seizure of the debtor's goods or the imprisonment of the debtor. The advantage of this system was its speed and simplicity compared to bringing a case through the regular courts, which could take a very long time. The Statute of Merchants was designed to facilitate commercial activity by making it easier to enforce debts, which would in theory encourage people to extend credit, which would encourage trade, which would benefit everyone. Whether it worked in practice was a question that contemporary merchants had views on, and those views were expressed in the continued revision and adjustment of the law over the following decades. The Jews of medieval Europe occupied a particular position in the law of debt, which was connected to the prohibition in canon law on Christians lending money at interest, because Christians were officially prohibited from usury, which was defined as lending at interest. A gap opened in the economy for people who were not subject to canon law. and Jews were permitted in many jurisdictions to lend at interest in circumstances where Christians could not. This created a legal situation that was complex and that produced a great deal of specific legislation about Jewish money lending in various countries, specifying the rates of interest permitted, the documentation required, the treatment of pledges left as security, and many other details of the lending relationship. This legislation is a significant part of medieval legal history, and it reflects the particular position of Jews in medieval European society in ways that are part of a much larger and more important historical discussion than we can have tonight. Chapter 10. Laws about trees. It might seem surprising that there were laws specifically about trees, but in the medieval economy, trees were significant assets, and assets are the kind of things that produce legal disputes, and legal disputes produce laws. Trees provided timber for building and for ships, wood for fuel and for charcoal, fruit for food, nuts for animals, bark for tanning, and mast, which was the collective term for nuts and fallen fruit, for feeding pigs in the autumn. All of these products had value, and the rights to them were regulated. The most extensive medieval law about trees was forest law, which governed the royal forests of England and the equivalent institutions in other countries. The royal forests were not simply areas of woodland. They were legally defined territories within which the king had special rights to deer and other game and to the trees, and within which the rights of ordinary people were restricted in ways that did not apply outside the forest bounds. The boundaries of the royal forest were precisely defined and periodically walked and re-established in a ceremony called the perambulation, in which officials walked the boundary and identified the trees and other markers that defined it. Within the royal forest, felling a tree without permission was a serious offence. The forest was divided into categories of jurisdiction, and the trees in different parts of the forest were protected to different degrees. The vert, which was the medieval legal term for the trees and undergrowth of the forest, as opposed to the deer, was protected because it provided the cover and the food that the deer needed. Damaging the vert was therefore damaging the deer indirectly, and the law treated it as a serious matter. Someone found cutting branches or felling trees in a royal forest without authorization could face significant penalties, including the loss of a hand in the more severe cases of earlier periods, though by the later medieval period fines had largely replaced physical punishment for forest offences. The rights to fallen wood were more widely distributed than the rights to standing trees. In many places, people who lived near a forest had the right to collect fallen branches and dead wood for fuel, a right called estover from an old French word meaning to be necessary. Estover was a precise right. You could take fallen wood, but you could not cut branches off living trees, even if the branches you took would have been small. The precision of this distinction reflects the importance of the right. Firewood was essential for warmth and cooking, and access to fallen wood in the forest was a significant benefit for people who could not afford to buy fuel. The regulation of this right, specifying exactly what could be taken and what could not, was therefore not a minor administrative detail, but a matter of real consequence for the daily lives of the people affected. The right to pannage, which was the right to let pigs into the forest in autumn to feed on the acorns and beech mast, was another precisely regulated right. Pannage was only available during a specific period in the autumn, typically from around late September to mid-November, and the holder of the right paid a fee for it. The fee was often calculated on the number of pigs driven into the forest, which required counting the pigs, which required the pigs to be counted at a specific place and a specific time by an official of the forest. The orderliness of this process, the pigs being driven to the counting point and tallied and then released into the forest for their autumn feast, is a very satisfying image to carry into sleep. Chapter 11. Laws about the Church and Daily. Life canon law, the law of the Church, touched almost every aspect of medieval daily life in ways that it is now difficult to fully appreciate, because the separation between religious authority and civil authority that we take for granted in most modern societies did not exist in the same way in the Middle Ages. The Church had jurisdiction over marriage and inheritance and wills, and a range of other matters that we would now consider entirely secular, and the church courts were real courts with real authority to impose real penalties, up to and including excommunication, which was the most severe spiritual penalty and which had real social and legal consequences. The laws about Sundays and feast days were among the most pervasive expressions of religious authority in daily life. On Sundays and on the feast days of the church calendar, work was supposed to stop. The shops were supposed to close. The market was not supposed to operate. The ploughing was not supposed to happen. The smithing was not supposed to happen. People were supposed to attend church services and observe the day in an appropriate manner. There were approximately 50 feast days of significant importance in the church calendar, in addition to Sundays, which meant that there were something like 100 days in a year on which work was officially prohibited or restricted. The enforcement of Sunday observance and feast day observance was a continuous challenge for both church and civic authorities, because the economic logic of markets and work tended to push against the religious logic of rest and worship. A market held on a feast day would attract buyers and sellers who wanted to trade regardless of what the calendar said. A smith who worked on a Sunday was meeting a real demand. The laws against this working were real, and the fines for working on prohibited days were real, and yet the practice continued, which tells us something about the relationship between law and behaviour that is as true in the medieval period as it is in any other. The laws about fasting were also significant. The Church required fasting in the form of abstaining from meat on Fridays, Saturdays in some traditions, the 40 days of Lent, and various other specified days. This meant that fish was required food on a substantial fraction of the days of the year for practicing Christians, which is why the fish trade was so significant and why fish was subject to such careful regulation. The fast days were also why fish ponds were important assets on many estates, providing a supply of fresh fish that did not depend on the sometimes uncertain supply of sea fish reaching inland markets. The obligation to fast was religious, but it had direct economic consequences that were regulated by law. Laws about swearing oaths were also part of the intersection of religious and civil authority. Oaths in the medieval period were sworn on the Bible or on relics, and the breaking of an oath was both a civil offence and a religious one. The oath was the primary mechanism for establishing the truth of testimony in legal proceedings, and the weight of an oath sworn on sacred objects was considered to be of a different order from a simple verbal statement. The precise form of the oath varied by jurisdiction and period, but the solemnity of the oath-taking was consistent, and the law treated false testimony given under oath, perjury, as a particularly serious offence. Chapter 12. Laws about foreigners and strangers. The medieval legal category of the stranger or the foreigner was a complicated one. Every town and every jurisdiction drew distinctions between those who belonged to it and those who did not, and the law treated insiders and outsiders differently. The insider, the burgess, or the freeman of a town had rights and obligations that the outsider did not share, and the outsider who wished to acquire those rights had to go through a specific process to do so. The freedom of a town, which was the legal status of being a full member of the town's community with all the rights that entailed, was acquired in one of three ways in most English towns: by birth to a father who was already a freeman, by apprenticeship to a freeman, and completion of the apprenticeship, or by purchase. Each route was subject to its own rules and its own fees and its own formalities, and the records of admissions to the freedom of various towns are among the most detailed and consistent records that survive from the medieval period, because the towns kept careful track of who was and was not a freeman, since the distinction had real legal and economic consequences. A foreigner trading in a town that had a guild of merchants or a guild of tradesmen in the relevant trade was at a significant legal disadvantage compared to the guild members. The guilds had the right to regulate trade within their jurisdiction, which included the right to exclude non-members from certain activities or to charge them additional fees. A foreigner, meaning a non-member, who wanted to sell cloth in a town where the cloth merchants had a guild, might be required to sell only wholesale, not retail, or might be required to conduct all their business through a local broker who was a guild member, or might be required to pay an additional fee called a toll or a customs payment. These restrictions were legally enforceable and were enforced because the guilds had both the motivation and the mechanisms to police their own trading territories. Alien merchants, meaning merchants from outside the kingdom altogether, were subject to additional layers of law. They might be required to stay in designated lodgings, called inns of host, where their trading activities could be monitored. They might be required to conclude all their transactions within a limited number of days and then leave. They might be required to sell to local merchants rather than directly to the public. They might be prohibited from trading in certain goods altogether. All of this was regulated by royal statute and by commercial treaties between kingdoms, and the specific rules changed frequently as the political and economic relationships between countries changed. The laws about hospitality to strangers had a different character, rooted in the religious obligation to show hospitality to travellers and to the poor. The injunction to welcome the stranger was a genuine moral and legal obligation in the medieval framework, balanced against the civic and economic interests in controlling and monitoring those who arrive from outside. The tension between these two imperatives, the obligation of welcome and the desire for control, produced a body of law and custom that tried to hold both at once, with varying degrees of success. Chapter 13. The peculiar laws of particular places. Every town and region of medieval Europe had its own particular legal quirks, rules that had grown out of specific local circumstances and that made perfect sense in their original context, but that look unusual when examined from outside. These local peculiarities are among the most entertaining parts of medieval legal history, in the mild and entirely sleep-appropriate sense of entertaining. The city of Chester, in England, had a custom known as the Pentasy Court, which was a court held in a covered passageway, called a pentasy, attached to one of the city's churches. The court met regularly and dealt with local commercial disputes. The specific location of the court under this covered passageway was its defining characteristic, and while the reason for this particular location has been variously explained over the years, the image of a court conducting its business under a covered walkway, with people passing by in the street a few feet away, is a pleasantly specific and undramatic picture of medieval justice in operation. The laws of some towns about the timing of the market had very precise provisions about the resolution of disputes. In some places, disputes arising from market transactions had to be resolved within the duration of the market itself, before the market closed for the day, on the theory that merchants who came from far away could not be expected to return for a later court session. This type of speedy justice, called the law merchant or lex mercatoria, operated in market towns and at the great trade fairs of medieval Europe, and the officials who administered it had to be capable of hearing and deciding cases quickly, which in practice meant relying on merchants' testimony and established commercial custom, rather than on the slower processes of the regular courts. The town of Shrewsbury had a law, recorded in the 13th century, about the playing of games in the streets. Specifically, the playing of certain ball games in the streets of Shrewsbury was prohibited, on the grounds that it was disruptive and occasionally dangerous to passers-by. This law would not be remarkable except for the specificity of its provisions about which streets and which times of day were covered, and for the fact that it had to be reissued on several occasions, which tells us that the young people of Shrewsbury continued to play ball in the streets, and that the authorities continued to disapprove, and that neither side succeeded in finally resolving the matter in the medieval period. The laws of various German towns about the specific conduct of the annual market often included very precise provisions about the size and placement of market stalls. Stalls had to be of a specified width, leaving specified amounts of space between them to ensure that the aisles between stalls were wide enough for the volume of people expected. The stakes used to hold up the awnings of stalls had to be placed within the stall's allocated space and not extend into the aisle. The awnings themselves had to be raised to a minimum height so that taller people could walk under them without ducking. These provisions read, when you encounter them in their original documents, as the work of someone who had spent a great deal of time thinking about the flow of foot traffic through a crowded market, and who had then attempted to solve the problems they had identified through the mechanism of a formal legal requirement, which is a very particular and very recognizable approach to a very particular kind of urban problem. Chapter 14. Laws about Games and Leisure. Medieval people played games, and medieval authorities had views about which games were appropriate and which were not, and these views were sometimes expressed in law. The laws about games and leisure in the medieval period tell us something about the anxieties of the ruling class, about what ordinary people were doing with their time when they were not working, and these anxieties were specific and sometimes surprising. Archery was a game that the English government actively encouraged, for the obvious reason that skilled archers were militarily useful. Laws requiring men of certain ages and statuses to practice archery on Sundays and feast days, and prohibiting them from playing certain other games that might take up the time they should have spent practicing, were issued repeatedly from the 14th century onward. The games specifically prohibited by these laws make an interesting list. Football was prohibited in several of these statutes, as was dice, quoits, and other various games that the lawmakers considered idle. The prohibition of football in 14th century England is perhaps the best known example of this type of law, and it is worth noting that what was called football at this time bore only a loose resemblance to any modern game of football, being played with a pig's bladder between teams of indefinite size across more or less unlimited terrain, and it was prohibited not because it was football but because it was not archery. The laws did not prevent people from playing football or from playing dice or from neglecting their archery practice. The periodic reissuance of the prohibition of football through the 14th and 15th centuries is evidence that it remained popular regardless of its legal status, which is a reminder that the relationship between law and behaviour is not as direct as lawmakers sometimes assume. Dice and other games of chance were subject to their own set of regulations, related to the general medieval disapproval of gambling. The concern was not merely moral but practical. Gambling led to disputes. Disputes led to violence. Violence disturbed the peace. Laws prohibiting or restricting gambling in public places, particularly in taverns and inns, were common in many towns, and were attempts to manage this chain of consequences. Innkeepers were often specifically prohibited from permitting gambling on their premises, on pain of losing their license to operate, which was a significant sanction and probably more effective than fines on individual gamblers. The tournaments and jousts of the nobility were also regulated by royal law, because tournaments, however entertaining, had a tendency to concentrate armed and aggressive men in one place, which was dangerous, and to provide opportunities for political conspiracy, which was worse. Royal licenses for tournaments were required in England from the 13th century, and the regulations about who could participate and how the event was to be conducted were specified in detail. The rules about the weapons permitted, the rules about the treatment of captured opponents, and the rules about the resolution of disputes arising from the tournament were all part of the legal framework that surrounded what might otherwise have looked like unregulated armed conflict. Chess was sometimes also the subject of legal comment, which might be surprising. In some ecclesiastical regulations, chess was criticised as a game that consumed time that should have been devoted to spiritual matters, and some religious houses prohibited their members from playing chess. The objection to chess was not that it was gambling, since chess was not typically played for money in the medieval period, but that it was absorbing and competitive and generated strong emotions of the sort that monastic life was supposed to temper. Whether monks and nuns actually gave up chess in response to these prohibitions is a question that the records do not definitively answer. Chapter 15. Laws about sanitation in the streets. The streets of medieval towns were a constant concern for civic authorities because medieval streets had a tendency to accumulate things that civic authorities did not want them to accumulate. The things accumulated included rubbish of all kinds, animal waste from the animals that walked and lived in the streets, water from the open drains that ran down the centres of many streets, mud in wet weather, dust in dry weather, and occasionally the contents of chamber pots emptied from windows above, which was a particular concern in towns with multi-storey buildings. Laws about the cleaning of streets were issued in virtually every medieval town of any significance. The obligation to keep clean the portion of the street in front of your house was perhaps the most common of these laws. Householders were required to sweep and clear their section of the street at specified intervals, which varied from town to town but was typically at least weekly and sometimes more frequent. The cleaning was not simply an aesthetic matter but a practical one, because streets blocked with rubbish and waste created problems for movement through the town and were associated in the medieval understanding with disease and bad air. The disposal of rubbish was also regulated. You were not supposed to throw rubbish into the street, which seems obvious, but the laws need to specify this tells us that it was being done. You were not supposed to leave rubbish in heaps in the street for extended periods, which required people to arrange for it to be taken somewhere. The somewhere was typically a designated dump outside the town walls, to which rubbish was supposed to be taken periodically. The arrangement and maintenance of this dumps was itself a regulated activity, and the obligation to use them rather than simply depositing waste wherever was convenient was one that the civic authorities had to keep reinforcing. The butchers of medieval towns were subject to particular regulation about the disposal of waste from their trade, because the waste from butchering, the blood and the entrails and the offal, was extremely odorous and extremely attractive to animals, and extremely problematic if left in the street. Laws requiring butchers to dispose of this waste in specific ways and in specific locations were common in many towns. In London, butchers at various periods were required to use the Thames for the disposal of certain types of waste, because the river carried it away, which transferred the problem rather than solving it, but at least moved it downstream. In other towns, butchers were required to bury waste or to take it to designated locations. The enforcement of these regulations was ongoing, because the practical pressures of a busy butchering trade tended to produce shortcuts that the law prohibited. The condition of the streets in wet weather was a persistent problem. Mud in medieval streets was not a minor inconvenience but a genuine obstacle. Heavily loaded carts would sink into deeply rutted mud and become stuck. Horses would slip. Pedestrians would be soaked and dirty. The paving of streets was a significant civic investment that many towns made in the later medieval period, extending the area of paved street gradually outward from the central market and the major roads. Laws about maintaining the paving and about not digging it up without permission were part of the legal framework around this investment. Chapter 16. The slow accumulation of order. We have now spent a considerable time with medieval law, and we have encountered laws about bread and animals and clothing and markets and noise and water and trees and the church and foreigners and local peculiarities and games and sanitation. And what we have found, if we have been paying careful attention, is not chaos and arbitrariness, but something more like the opposite. A very thorough and very determined attempt to impose order on the complexity of medieval life. The laws are specific because the problems they address are specific. A law about the width of a market stall awning exists because someone's awning was too low and someone was inconvenienced. A law about pigs wandering in London streets exists because pigs wandered in London streets and this was a problem. A law about the weight of bread exists because bread was sometimes underweight and people needed to eat. The laws are responses to real situations experienced by real people, and their specificity is not a sign of excessive regulation, but of engagement with the actual texture of daily life. The accumulation of all these laws over centuries created a very thick body of regulation, much of which overlapped and some of which contradicted, but which together constituted the legal environment within which medieval people lived. They knew some of these laws intimately, because the laws most relevant to their daily lives were the ones about bread and markets and the cleaning of streets and the keeping of animals. They may not have known the finer points of forest law if they did not live near a royal forest, or the details of merchant law if they were not merchants. But the general principle that the world was regulated by rules and that those rules had consequences when violated was known by almost everyone. And in all of this there is something that is, like everything else we have considered tonight, rather steady and rather ordinary. The laws were made by people who were trying to solve problems. The problems were ordinary problems, food being short-weighted, animals being in the wrong place, water being dirty, streets being impassable. The solutions were ordinary solutions. Write it down, make it official, appoint someone to enforce it, specify the penalty for violation. Round and round, law after law, regulation after regulation, the medieval world trying to organize itself into a place that worked. It is a very human project, and it continues today in forms that are in many ways quite similar, and it will continue long after us in forms that will seem strange to whoever examines them several hundred years hence. The laws change. The project of regulation, of writing down the rules of the shared world, and then trying to get people to follow them, remains. But all of that is for another time. Tonight the laws have been examined. The bread has been weighed, the pigs have been counted, the market stalls have been measured and the awnings raised to the correct height. The streets are clean, and the streets ahead, the ones leading toward morning, are quiet and straight and unobstructed. You can rest now. The laws are all in order. Everything has been weighed and measured and found to be correct. The curfew bell is rung, the fires are covered, the night watch is walking, the town is quiet, and you are quiet too, or nearly quiet, or at the very least in the particular stillness that comes from following a long and unhurried account of things that happened in a world very different from yours, but not, when examined closely, so different in its essential qualities, its need for order and its tendency toward disorder, and its patient ongoing attempt to find the balance between the two. Sleep now. The curfew has rung. Everything is as it should be. The night is old and knows what it is doing. Rest inside it. Good night. A final note on the silence of old documents. there is one more thought for those who find themselves still present at the end of all of this. The laws we have been reading about tonight were written down by people who are now gone, in buildings that are mostly gone, about a world that is entirely gone in its specific form, though its general shape remains recognizable. The parchment on which many of them were written is itself mostly gone. What survives is a subset, the things that happen to be copied and preserved, and to survive the fires and the floods, and the general entropy that destroys most things over most centuries. Reading these old documents, when you have the chance to encounter them in archives or in printed editions, is a particular kind of experience. The handwriting is someone's handwriting, made by a particular hand holding a particular pen in a particular room, probably cold, probably lit by a window or by a candle, the writer working carefully and without haste, making the letters as the letters had always been made, putting down the words as they had been told to them or as they understood them, adding the document to the pile of documents that was accumulating on the shelf. The writer did not know that anyone would be reading what they wrote several hundred years later. They were simply doing their job, recording what needed to be recorded, maintaining the record that the institution required. They wrote the law about pigs with the same attention and the same care as every other law, not because pigs in the street would be of interest to anyone in the far future, but because right now, in their present, pigs in the street were a real problem, and the law was a real attempt to address it. This ordinariness of the past is comforting when you let it be. The past was full of people doing their ordinary jobs in an ordinary way, most of them without any sense that what they were doing would be remembered or read. They swept the streets and weighed the bread, and walked the night watch and wrote the law and went to bed when the curfew bell rang. They did thus things in the dark and the cold and the rain, and in the warm summers too, and they were tired at the end of each day in the same way that you are tired at the end of this day, and the dark received them in the same way that the dark receives you. They slept. You will sleep. The old parchment sits in the archive, quiet and still, holding the words that were written on it centuries ago about pigs and bread and market stalls and forest rights and curfew bells, all of it settled and still and far away. And you are settled and still too. The night is here. The curfew is long since rung. Sleep now. Sleep well. The laws are all in order. Everything is as it should be. Good night. Chapter 17. Laws about guilds and crafts. The guilds of medieval Europe were private organizations with public authority, which is a combination that sounds contradictory, but which worked reasonably well in practice for several centuries. A guild was an association of people practicing the same trade, and the guild's purpose was to regulate that trade in the interests of its members and, in theory, in the interests of the public who consumed the trade's products. The guild set standards for the quality of work, the training of new craftspeople, the prices at which goods could be sold, and the conditions under which the trade could be practiced. All of this regulatory activity was backed by legal authority granted by the town or the king, making the guild's rules not merely the rules of a private club but law in the full sense. The structure of a guild was hierarchical in a very specific way. At the bottom were the apprentices, who were young people who had been contracted to learn the trade from a master craftsperson, typically for a term of 7 years. During the apprenticeship, the apprentice lived in the master's household, received no wages but was clothed and fed and taught, and was subject to the authority of the master in all things related to the work, and much related to life more generally. The master was legally responsible for the apprentice's conduct, which gave the master both authority and liability, and the apprentice indenture, the legal document recording the terms of the apprenticeship, specified the obligations on both sides in considerable detail. After the apprenticeship was complete, the apprentice became a journeyman. A journeyman was a trained craftsperson who could work for wages but who was not yet a master. The word journeyman comes from the French journey, meaning a day, and refers to the fact that journeymen were paid by the day. Journeymen worked for masters and could move from one master to another, gaining experience and saving money, with the goal eventually of becoming a master themselves. To become a master required producing a masterpiece, which was a piece of work submitted for examination by the guild and paying a fee to the guild, and sometimes other requirements that varied by guild and by town. The guild's control over entry to the trade meant that it could restrict the number of people practicing, which kept the market from being flooded with practitioners and kept the earnings of existing masters at a reasonable level. This was not entirely in the interest of consumers, who might have preferred more competition and lower prices, but it was very much in the interest of the guild members, and the guild members were the ones with the political influence to maintain the system. The tension between the guild's protective function for its members and the public interest in affordable goods was managed differently in different times and places, and the legal history of guilds is in part a history of this ongoing tension. The guild also maintained quality standards through the system of marking goods. In many trades, finished goods were required to bear a mark identifying the maker. This mark allowed defective goods to be traced back to their maker, and the maker to be held accountable. The system of hallmarking precious metals, which survives to the present day in modified form, grew out of exactly this guild regulatory tradition. The mark on a piece of silver or gold is a record of when it was made, where it was assayed, and whether it passed the assay, and the marks were applied by the assay office as a guarantee of quality to anyone buying the piece. The medieval goldsmiths' guild in London and the goldsmiths' guilds in other major cities of Europe developed and maintained this system with considerable thoroughness, and the records they kept are among the most detailed surviving documents of medieval craft regulation. The rules about working on Sundays and feast days, which we have already mentioned in connection with religious law, were also guild rules enforced by the guild, alongside their enforcement by the church and civic authorities. A craftsperson who worked on a prohibited day was violating the guild's rules as well as the church's rules, which meant that there were two sets of people who might come and ask them to stop. The redundancy of enforcement was not entirely inefficient. It meant that the prohibition was reinforced from multiple directions, and that there was no single failure point that would make the regulation collapse. The guild also had social functions that went alongside its regulatory ones. Guilds maintained altars in churches and paid for the saying of masses for the souls of deceased members. They provided support for sick or impoverished members. They organised the feast day celebrations associated with their patron saint. They participated in the ceremonial life of the town, marching in processions in their livery, performing the mystery plays that were staged on religious feast days, presenting themselves as a coherent and significant part of the community. All of this social activity was regulated by the guild's own rules and by the customs that had developed over generations, and the guild member who failed to participate in these activities was failing in their obligations in much the same way as the guild member who sold goods of inferior quality. Chapter 18. Laws about inheritance and property. Property law in the medieval period was extensive and complex because property was the foundation of power and status, and the rules about who owned what and who could inherit what had consequences that rippled through every aspect of social life. We will not attempt to give a complete account of medieval property law, because a complete account would take considerably longer than a single evening of sleep preparation, and because it would require a considerable amount of Latin. Instead, we will look at a few of its more specific and interesting provisions. The law of primogeniture, which governed the inheritance of land in much of medieval Europe, held that land passed to the eldest son. This was the rule for noble families holding land by feudal tenure, and it had a logic that was clear even if its consequences were not always comfortable. Keeping the land together in one holding preserved the military and economic power of the family, and dividing it among all the children would have gradually fragmented it into pieces too small to support the obligations attached to it. The eldest son inherited the land and the title and the obligations. The younger sons received lesser provision and were expected to make their own way, which they did in various ways: the church, the law, the military, trade, or service to a great lord. The legal machinery for the transfer of land was elaborate. In England, the transfer of a freehold estate was accompanied by a ceremony called livery of seisin, in which the transfer physically handed to the transferee a piece of the land itself, sometimes a handful of earth or a twig from a tree growing on the property, in the presence of witnesses and with the appropriate words spoken. The physical nature of this ceremony was connected to the physical nature of land itself. The land could not be carried into a court and handed over like a piece of paper, so instead a symbolic piece of the land was handed over, and the ceremony made the transfer legal and visible. After the ceremony, the new owner had seisin, meaning effective possession, of the property. The legal concept of the fee tale was an attempt to keep land within families across generations. Land held in fee tale was entailed, meaning it was restricted to pass only to specified heirs, typically the direct descendants of the original grantee, and could not be sold or given away. The purpose was to prevent a profligate or improvident heir from selling the family land and leaving their descendants without it. The law of entail and the various attempts to break entails to disentail property that had been entailed by a previous generation occupied a considerable amount of legal attention in the later medieval period and beyond, as people who owned entailed property discovered the restrictions inconvenient and looked for ways around them. The legal mechanisms for breaking entails were themselves elaborate, involving fictions that were understood by all parties to be fictions, but that nonetheless produced the desired legal result, which tells us something interesting about the relationship between law and reality. The law of dower protected the widow's interest in her late husband's property. In most medieval legal systems, a widow had the right to use a portion of her husband's land for the rest of her life, after which it would pass to the heir. This portion was typically a third, the widow's third, and it was inalienable, meaning the husband could not give it away or sell it without the wife's consent, because doing so would deprive her of her dower rights after his death. The legal protection of the widow's dower was an important safeguard in a world where women had few independent legal rights, and the enforcement of dower rights was a significant source of litigation in the medieval courts. The Church's role in inheritance law was expressed most directly through the testamentary jurisdiction, the law of wills. Wills were proved in the church courts, and the executors of wills were subject to church court supervision. This gave the Church significant influence over the distribution of property at death, and the Church used this influence partly to encourage charitable bequests. A will that left something to the Church or to charitable purposes was looked on favourably, and the deathbed was sometimes a moment at which considerable pressure was applied to ensure that the dying person made appropriate provision for the salvation of their soul, which conveniently took the form of leaving money or property to religious institutions. The laws about intestacy, dying without a will, also fell within church jurisdiction in many places, and the distribution of the intestate's property followed specific rules that gave the church and the surviving family their respective shares. A person who died without a will in medieval England had their goods divided in thirds, 1/3 to the spouse, 1/3 to the children, and 1/3 to pious purposes, meaning in practice to the church. This three-part division, like many legal rules, was modified and adjusted over time as circumstances changed and as the parties affected by it found ways to work around or against it. Chapter 19. Laws about violence and the peace. Medieval law took violence seriously, which might seem obvious but is worth stating clearly because there is sometimes a misconception that medieval society simply accepted violence as a normal part of life and made no attempt to regulate it. This is not accurate. Medieval law was very interested in violence, specifically in the question of what kind of violence was legally permitted and what kind was not. The King's Peace was the legal concept that underpinned much of the regulation of violence in medieval England, and equivalent concepts existed in other medieval kingdoms. The King's Peace meant that the king had a particular interest in the maintenance of order, and that violence committed in certain contexts was an offence not just against the immediate victim but against the king himself. Violence committed on the king's highway, within the king's markets, within the church, or in the presence of the king or his representatives was a breach of the king's peace, and was treated with particular severity. The concept gradually expanded over the medieval period until the King's Peace was, in theory, coextensive with the entire kingdom, meaning that all violence anywhere was technically a breach of it. The legal distinction between murder and manslaughter had its origins in the medieval period. Murder in the medieval legal sense was killing that was done secretly or by ambush, where the killer had concealed themselves and then attacked without warning, and then had concealed the body or fled. Manslaughter was killing that was open and obvious, including killing in a fight that had developed in public. The distinction mattered because murder attracted a more severe penalty than manslaughter, which reflected the greater threat to public order posed by secret killings, since a community could not protect itself against a killer who acted in secret. The appeal of felony was a legal procedure by which a victim of crime, or the family of the murder victim, could bring a personal accusation against the alleged criminal in court. This was different from the king's prosecution, in which the accusation was brought by the crown, and the appeal of felony had its own elaborate procedural rules. The accuser had to appear in court and swear a specific oath and describe the crime in exact terms, and if the procedure was not followed precisely, the appeal could be dismissed on procedural grounds. The accused could challenge the accuser to trial by battle, which was a procedurally available option that in practice was rarely used, but whose availability shaped the nature of the appeal procedure in significant ways. The hue and cry was the legal obligation of all men to pursue a fleeing criminal. If a crime was committed and the criminal fled, the victim or a bystander was supposed to raise the hue and cry, calling out to summon others to join the pursuit. Every able-bodied man who heard the hue and cry was legally obliged to join the pursuit. Failure to join the hue and cry when it was raised could be punished by fine. The hue and cry was, in the absence of any professional police force, the community's primary mechanism for catching criminals in the act of fleeing, and it could be surprisingly effective in small communities where everyone knew everyone and a stranger running through the village was immediately conspicuous. The sanctuary law allowed a person accused of a crime to take refuge in a church and be temporarily protected from arrest. The sanctuary seeker had to get inside the church and then had to confess the crime to the coroner and agree to leave the country by a specified route within a specified period. During this period, the sanctuary was not supposed to be violated by the forces of the law. The logic of sanctuary was religious. The church was a holy place under divine protection, and the extension of this protection to those who fled to it was a reflection of the church's particular moral authority. The practical operation of sanctuary was more complicated, because sanctuary could be used by professional criminals as a way of avoiding justice, and the legal authorities were repeatedly trying to limit the scope of sanctuary, while the church was trying to maintain it. The laws about self-defense specified under what conditions killing was legally justified. Killing in clear self-defense when there was no opportunity to retreat, and the killer genuinely faced death if they did not act, was excusable. But the law required a genuine attempt to retreat before resorting to killing, and a killing that could have been avoided by retreating might not be covered by the self-defense justification. The detailed working out of these distinctions in individual cases occupied the medieval courts and the medieval legal commentators at considerable length, because the facts of individual cases rarely fell cleanly into the legal categories, and the judgment of what was genuine self-defense and what was an excuse for aggression required careful evaluation of the specific circumstances. Chapter 20. Laws about the sea and ships. The sea presented medieval law with particular challenges, because the sea was not owned by anyone in the same way that land was owned. Ships were mobile in ways that made jurisdiction difficult to establish, and the commerce that went on at sea was international, in a world where legal authority was almost entirely national or local. The law of the sea, the law merchant of maritime trade, and the law about shipwrecks were all significant areas of medieval legal development. The law of shipwreck was one of the earliest areas of maritime law to be formalized. When a ship wrecked on a coast, the question of who owned the cargo was immediately pressing. The local lord, if the coast was within their jurisdiction, often claimed the right to all goods washed up from a shipwreck under a doctrine called wreck of the sea. This meant that the merchants who had owned the cargo lost everything when their ship wrecked, regardless of whether the wreck was through storm or through the negligence of those on shore who might have failed to mark hazards properly. The Magna Carta of 1215 contained a provision about merchants who survived shipwrecks, allowing that if a merchant's goods came ashore after a wreck and the merchant themselves survived, the goods should be returned to the merchant. This was an improvement from the merchant's perspective, though it left open the situation where no merchant survived. Subsequent legislation refined the rules, and by the 13th century English law had developed the rule that if any living creature, person or animal survived from a wrecked ship, the ship and cargo were not technically wreck, but were instead held for the owner to claim. This produced the remarkable legal situation in which the survival of a cat or a dog on a wrecked ship could potentially save the cargo for its owners, which was noted at the time and presumably had some effect on the treatment of ships' cats. The rules about harbours and ports were detailed and specific. Every port had its own customs, its own schedule of dues and fees, its own rules about where ships of different sizes could moor, how long they could stay, what goods could be loaded and unloaded, and in what order. The collection of customs, which was the tax on imported and exported goods, was a major source of royal revenue, and the machinery for collecting it was complex and required detailed regulation. The king's customs officials at each port had their own rules and their own record-keeping requirements, and the records they produced, which survive in many cases, are detailed accounts of every ship that passed through, every cargo, every payment made and withheld. The rules about the loading of ships were also the subject of law in some places, because an overloaded ship was more likely to sink, and a sunken ship was a loss to everyone involved. The law that eventually produced the Plimsoll Line in the 19th century had medieval predecessors in local regulations about the maximum loading of ships in particular harbours, which were attempts by port authorities to prevent the departure of ships so heavily laden that they were likely to founder. Whether these regulations were consistently applied is another question, because the incentive to load as much cargo as possible was very strong, and the people who owned the cargo were often more influential than the harbour officials. The laws about pirates were straightforward in principle and complicated in practice. Piracy was universally condemned, and piracy was also widely practiced, and the line between a pirate and a privateer, a person who preyed on the ships of an enemy with the authorization of their own king, was sometimes very thin and sometimes entirely invisible. The legal treatment of captured pirates varied. Under some circumstances they could be hanged. Under others they could be ransomed. Under others they could be pardoned if they agreed to serve in the navy or to hand over information about their associates. The inconsistency of the treatment of piracy reflected the inconsistency of the legal status of maritime violence, which remained a genuinely complicated area for much longer than more land-based violence. Chapter 21. The Slow Return of Quiet. We have now spent a very considerable time with medieval law. We have looked at it from many angles. We have seen it in markets and in forests, at sea and in the streets, in the guild halls and in the church courts and in the night watches' rounds through the dark. We have seen it addressing the most ordinary concerns of daily life, the weight of a loaf of bread, the wandering of a pig, the height of a market stall awning, and the most significant, the inheritance of land, the regulation of violence, the rights of the shipwrecked. And in all of this, the quality that strikes most consistently is not the strangeness, though some of it is strange, and not the harshness, though some of it is harsh, but the persistence of the attempt to make rules, to write them down, to enforce them, to revise them when they were not working, to issue them again when they were being ignored, to keep on trying to make the world a more ordered place through the mechanism of written law. It did not always work. Law rarely works perfectly in any period. But the attempt was genuine, and the effort was sustained, and the body of law that accumulated over the medieval centuries was, in its vast and sometimes contradictory totality, a record of what people in that time thought mattered and how they thought it should be handled. The pigs and the bread and the market stalls and the forest rights and the widow's dower and the hue and cry all mattered to the people who made the laws about them, and the making of the laws was their way of saying so. That is enough for tonight. The candle is burning low, in the way that candles burn in stories that are ending, not dramatically, not suddenly, just gradually less and less bright, the flame smaller, the light softer, the shadows in the room becoming gentler and more general. The market is closed, the stalls are taken down, the weights and measures are put away. The bread has been weighed and found correct. The animals are penned. The streets have been swept. The curfew bell has rung. The watch is walking its route through the quiet town, the lantern making its small circle of warmth in the dark. And you are somewhere quiet and warm at the end of a day that is over, in the dark that is the same dark that has covered all of these laws and all of these lives for all of these centuries, patient and still and indifferent in the kindest possible sense, receiving everything at the end of every day and asking nothing in return. Rest in the dark. Let the laws be what they are, far away and long ago, somewhere on a shelf in a room in a building that may no longer exist, or copied into books that are in archives, or translated into the kind of patient prose that helps a listening mind settle. The bread was the right weight. The pig was found and counted. The curfew has rung. Good night. Sleep well. The night is here, and it knows exactly what it's doing, and it will hold you through until morning without any instruction from you at all. You only need to let it. Let it. Good night. Extended reflections on how medieval people understood their own laws. For those who are still awake, which is becoming an increasingly small group as the night progresses, and the details of medieval bread regulation settle into the mind, and the mind becomes quieter, and the breathing becomes slower. Here are some further thoughts on how medieval people thought about and understood the laws they lived under. Medieval people did not think about law in the way that modern legal scholars think about law. They did not have a clear concept of law as something made by a legislature and enforced by an executive and interpreted by a judiciary, with these three functions separated and balanced against each other. They had something more like a sense that the law was an expression of right order, of the way things were supposed to be, and that this right order had been established by God and by long custom, and by the accumulated wisdom of people who had thought carefully about how communities should function. This meant that new laws were often framed not as innovations, but as clarifications or restorations of what had always been the case. When a king issued a new statute, it was often described as confirming or declaring the ancient customs of the kingdom, even if it was actually making something quite new. The appeal to ancient custom gave the law a quality of inevitability and permanence that a frankly new law might not have had, and it connected the new law to the long chain of laws that had preceded it, giving it a kind of legitimacy by association. The concept of natural law was important in medieval legal thinking. Natural law was the law that could be discerned by reason, independent of any particular statute or custom, as the law that right reason would produce in any well-ordered society. It was connected to divine law, because reason was the faculty given by God to humans, and the law that reason produced was therefore in accordance with God's purposes. When a statute contradicted natural law, there was a question about which should prevail, and the medieval lawyers who worked on this question produced sophisticated arguments about the relationship between positive law, the law actually enacted and enforced, and natural law, the law that ought to be. The practical enforcement of medieval law depended less on professional enforcement officials than on the community itself. The system of frank pledge, which operated in much of rural England, required all adult men to be enrolled in groups of 10 called tithings, and each member of the tithing was responsible for ensuring the good conduct of the others, and for producing any member who was accused of a crime. If a member of the tithing absconded or committed a crime and was not produced for justice, the whole tithing could be fined. This made the community collectively responsible for the conduct of its members, which was an effective enforcement mechanism in small communities where everyone knew everyone, but which became harder to maintain as communities grew larger and more mobile. The sworn jury was another mechanism that embedded law enforcement in the community. The jury was not, in its medieval form, a body that decided whether someone was guilty or not guilty after hearing evidence. It was, in its earlier form, a body of local men who were called upon to give information from their own knowledge about facts that were relevant to a legal question. The jurors were called because they were supposed to know. They were neighbours of the person in question. They had lived in the same community. They knew what had happened and what was customary. The jury, as a means of community knowledge being brought to bear on legal questions, was a distinctly medieval institution, and its evolution toward the modern form in which jurors are supposed to be neutral and ignorant of the facts before hearing evidence is a story that stretches across many centuries. The church courts operated on different principles from the secular courts. They used a procedure called inquisitorial procedure, in which the judge was also the investigator, asking questions and pursuing the inquiry according to the judge's own sense of what needed to be known. This was in contrast to the accusatorial procedure of the common law courts, in which the judge was passive and the parties to the dispute or the prosecution drove the proceeding. The inquisitorial procedure was more efficient in some ways because the judge could focus on what seemed most relevant, but it depended on the integrity and competence of the judge in ways that the accusatorial procedure did not, because the judge in the inquisitorial system had more power, and therefore more opportunity to use that power either well or badly. The appeal from one court to a higher court was an established mechanism in both the church and the secular systems, though the paths of appeal were different and the ultimate authority differed. In church courts, the ultimate authority was the Pope in Rome, and appeals to Rome, while expensive and time-consuming, were genuinely available. In the secular courts, the ultimate authority was the king, through the various superior courts that operated in the king's name. The existence of these appeal mechanisms meant that the law was not simply what any individual judge or local court said it was, but was subject to correction from above, which was both a safeguard against local injustice and a source of considerable litigation. All of this legal machinery, the tithings and the juries and the courts and the appeals and the papal jurisdiction and the royal authority, hummed along through the medieval centuries, handling the disputes and the crimes and the property transfers and the inheritances that medieval life constantly generated. It was not a perfect system. It was not even a single system. It was a collection of overlapping and sometimes competing systems that together constituted the legal environment of medieval life, and navigating it required knowledge and often money and sometimes simply good luck. But it kept going. The courts met on their regular days. The cases were brought and heard and decided. The fines were levied and some of them were paid. The laws were written and copied and stored. The clerks wrote their careful entries in their record books, and the whole thing accumulated year by year, decade by decade, century by century, into the vast and slightly chaotic repository of medieval legal knowledge that historians and legal scholars still explore today, looking for the specific and the ordinary and the occasionally surprising detail that tells them something true about how people lived a very long time ago. And now it is very late. The record books are closed. The clerks have gone to their beds. The courts are empty. The night has been going on for some time now, and it shows no signs of ending, which is as it should be, because the night is patient and thorough, and it will not end until it is time to end, and it is not yet time. You are still here, in the dark, in the warmth, in the particular comfort of a bed that has been waiting for you, and that now has you in it, and is performing its function of supporting you, and keeping you warm without requiring anything from you at all. Nothing is required. The laws have all been read. The tithings are in order. The jury has reached its verdict, which is that the night is quiet and everything is as it should be, and there is no disturbance to report. The watch has walked the final circuit. The lantern is extinguished. Sleep